exploring the intersection of resilient technology, organizations, and people. REdeploy.
So, for those of you who were here yesterday, you know one of the things that we talked about was how cool it was that we're coming at resilience from all of these different angles, and so most of us have different backgrounds. We might all be in tech, but we're coming at it from very different angles and kind of seeing it as a holistic picture. So I'd love to hear from each of you, just a couple sentences. Why are you so passionate about resilience? Why are you so passionate about these topics? Why are you excited to be here?
You want to go?
There you go.
All right.
Go for it.
So I think, as I talked about a little bit in my talk, where this really came up was from a personal perspective, so like the psychological resilience, and both from a post-traumatic stress perspective, and also Brene Brown talks about shame resilience. So that's another thing to go look up and find the TED Talks about shame resilience if you want to learn this kind of resilient stuff. And I've seen that to be really effective in my personal life, so.
I'll take the microphone from Matty and roll with it. Yeah, I definitely think of it as a community builder, as like my primary skill set that I'm coming from is one where like I think people, we have an unhealthy relationship with failure where we pay a lot of lip service to it in our industry, like fail fast and break things and move forward. But we kind of forget the human ramifications of that, like that sense of failure that really brings people into hiding and makes them lose track of their career. And that sense of bringing resiliency to systems and people really hits home for me. And I wanted to really explore here like the relationship of resiliency to concept of anti-fragility, this idea that when you break something, it actually gets stronger instead of actually needing to be hunkered down, the whole pivoting idea. And I really heard that message resonated throughout the 2 days.
I can go next. So I think sort of tying off on that,
I'm going to interrupt for a second. Can you use Matt's mic instead?
yes.
Thank you.
It sounds so much better.
Yeah.
But resiliency isn't the lack of vulnerability necessarily. It's the processing and accepting of vulnerability. I think both in systems and in people, being able to be vulnerable and also just being aware that you are a person, you're not a robot. And I think oftentimes, especially in the tech industry, we forget that. So just for me, I know like my talk about mindfulness and just has helped me to be more resilient. And it's something that I'm very passionate about. I want to share with people because I think burnout is like all too real, and resiliency is a great way to combat that.
Agreed.
Let's use the non-chat.
I think, for me, resiliency, I think, gives you a lot of space to be more intentional about your work, and I think people do their best work when they're doing it intentionally and not like under duress. So giving people more opportunity to do their best stuff.
Absolutely.
So I'm excited about, let's just use the one mic, it's better. All right. So I'm excited about studying this because back when I went to college, I majored in physics, and I loved the Newtonian physics, and I loved the determinism of it. And then I got to quantum physics, and it was all not predictable anymore. And I was like, well, this sucks. So I went into programming, right? Because programming is perfectly predictable. And it was for a while. I got to maintain that illusion, but it's certainly not anymore. But now I'm older, and now I think that's awesome. And I love that we can embrace the unpredictability of it, and that doesn't mean we can't know anything about it. And to me, adaptability is all about can we maintain our identity and change to fit the environment that's changing around us.
I like that.
So I guess in school, I found technical problems fun. And I've been in situations where you're just so exasperated because you can't solve a problem.
There you go.
Can't solve a problem. So I think my interest lies in how many times I've had to change the way I was thinking, like fundamentally, and then you have these aha moments, and that's like an awesome feeling. And I think this is like some of the most different ways of thinking that I've ever had to do, and the rewards are some of the most rewarding moments that I've ever had, and the impact is not just to cool, like we just survived Prime Day, or we just survived like, you know, something that you thought could never fail. But it's also cool, like other people, people after me are doing this way better than I did it. And I don't know, like it's fun that way. And I think it's a question like what I want to get out of this conference, or what I've got.
Why you're passionate about these topics?
Oh, I'm passionate. So I guess that's why I'm passionate, and I think like one of the things I was talking about was even today, like coming here and hearing people talk makes me question like the new assumptions that I have created even in the past year. I should go revisit them and think about what they're now missing, because things are always changing, and what I'm not capturing in my thoughts, and yeah, keep revisiting what I think I already know.
Laura?
I think we're working. I think that the time is right. You know, we're sort of introducing new forms of automation. We're looking at how do we team more appropriately with artificial intelligence. How do we, you know, extend the capabilities and the scale and the scope and the speed at which we do things, and the sort of older ways of thinking about how to do that just don't apply anymore. You know, there's a lot of conversation in society around how humans are the weak link and people are sort of fallible and they need to be constrained and controlled. But it's pretty extraordinary, the capacities that we do have to be able to make sense of incredible amounts of information and dynamic conditions. And so I think you know, resiliency really supports that and helps us to move forward more constructively.
Thank you.
These two mics. Yep. Are we ready for regular, or not regular, but other Q&A? So I think you were first.
Yeah. So I've heard several program, and I was.
Second. Sorry. Technical difficulty.
So I've heard several references to a LIND program, and I was curious what that was.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
I've heard several references to a LIND program, and I was curious what that was.
I'm going to jump that. Yeah. Again, I have to tell the joke. It's the John Allspa Swedish School of Postmortems. No. Laura?
So the LUND program is a very unique program that is designed for working professionals. It's a 2-year master's program which involves on-campus residencies in Sweden, and you just meet a remarkable cohort of doctors, pilots, you know, nuclear power plant operators, you know, maritime sea captains, just a really diverse group of people who are all sort of very interested in risk and resilience and human factors. And so I think there's 4 residency periods of about a week each, and then you're well supported and set up to do your own research within your organization. And Sweden does not allow you to pay for your own education, so you have to be funded by your organization.
Socialists.
And it's you can actually attend the learning labs independently as well. I think they're about $1,500 for the week or so, Canadian dollars. So.
And to be clear, that's LUND, correct?
It's named after the city in Sweden.
Yeah.
Behind you. Yeah, so I feel like I've heard of mindfulness, and it's usually targeted at individuals and sort of introspection and sort of personal approach to resolving difficulties and stuff like that. Have you, any of you, seen any examples of sort of team-based mindfulness, or a bit of modifications to workflows that are day-to-day things that can be translated to sort of make people be more mindful as they're deciding things?
Is that a retro?
I think so. I think retrospective is a way that we can inject mindfulness into a community group. But I think that going beyond a retro or a postmortem or something like that, it's also about being vulnerable and also receiving vulnerability. So having a mindful standpoint as a group and working together for a more mindful community is about that awareness and being respectful, being listening. A lot of things that Hannah talked about yesterday in her talk, how people make up teams, but teams also make people. And if you have a positive environment that you can share things, you have people that listen and are there for you, it's a lot easier to have that sort of vulnerability and awareness of yourself and others.
Go ahead.
I think of mindfulness also of when you're going through, say, a process or someone tells you to do something, so you're given a priority or a deliverable or a task. I really like the approach of mindfulness towards thinking about why is this task important for me to do right now and not just blindly doing it, and how someone has prescribed you to do it and suggested, especially if you're a junior developer and a senior developer tells you this is the problem and this is the solution, implement it. Taking the time to understand why that is the way to implement it. What are the other options? And that's sort of mindfulness in terms of when you're solving or when you're coding, not just sort of blindly following things, which is easy to do, I think, especially in the beginning.
I was just going to say, to add to that, a lot of that I think comes from the leadership in the company, right? So it's fantastic to be able to feel like you can be vulnerable within your team, but the only way an individual contributor is going to feel that way is if their manager sets that expectation. So I'd encourage those of you who are managers here to keep that in mind as you're growing your team, as you're doing your one-on-ones, as you're mentoring people within your team, that yes, it requires both you as well as your teammates and your employees to allow that vulnerability, but it starts a lot with the management and with you.
Yeah, so I think this 2-day conference, I find it extremely useful, and the conversation has always been around the human resilience and how to treat the team, right? I mean, with certain aspects in mind. So, but there is one word that I haven't heard in this 2-day conference is accountability. So how does that fall in with, is it an human resiliency to, I mean, how does that come in, for the accountability? Because for me, right, as a development manager, I am accountable for every single one of my team, right? And so I just want to find out,
That's a good question.
I have opinions, but
Go for it. Start with it. Yeah.
no. I mean, I think we didn't talk about it because I think it's so prevalent in the culture, and it's not going to go away. I don't think this is about, get rid of everything. That is the status quo. It's sort of like built on top of it. But I think accountability is important for yourself. I think it's more important when a teammate takes accountability for their own thing and less useful when I point at them and be like, you are accountable. So when I think of accountability, I encourage people to take accountability themselves, and you as a development manager and me as well, I take accountability for when there is a mistake in my team, because I think that's where team culture comes into play. How can you facilitate and improve the team culture so that it doesn't happen again? So that's sort of, yeah.
I was just going to say, and I think, John, you've said this before, right? That blameless does not mean lack of accountability, right? And I think you really hit the nail on the head in saying the difference is the direction that the finger is pointing, right? But when we think, when thinking about retrospectives or anything like that, there's still work to be done, and someone has to do that work, and there's follow-up to be done. So, but I really like that analogy of where
Yeah.
that's happening.
And it manifests eventually, like, you know, if you have someone who is really struggling, it's your accountability to mentor that person and make them better. But at the end of the day, if like it's not working out, like what eventually happens stays the same. And you can call that accountability, like the end result, right?
I think another part of it is being accountable about knowing your limits. And if you have bitten off more than you can chew, if you're reaching that critical area of breakdown, that you are accountable to be honest about it in a way and be open and let someone know, reach out. Not to say that that is something that it's like, it shouldn't feel like pressure. It should feel like freedom. That when you are overwhelmed, you can reach out to someone and they've got your back. And I think that that is, especially from a managerial standpoint, creating that psychological safety where you can reach out to someone and say that you need help is really crucial in the business that we're doing. And it helps maintain that sense of accountability that the tasks are getting done. It's just that from a human standpoint, we're making sure that each person is still empowered and resilient.
I think that's where some of that trust comes in, right? Is the two-way, like, yes, I'm responsible for this thing. I also know if at any point I don't feel capable of doing this thing, I have the ability and the safety to be able to approach my manager and say, help. And then my manager steps in and helps me to continue to be accountable and responsible for that thing with their guidance or with someone else on the team helping me out or something of that framework.
Can we hear from Laura on accountability with the academics and researchers?
Well, I was going to say it's a great question because I think so much of work is so interdependent these days that it's hard to sort of parse out like who owns what and where the scope of responsibility sort of lies. So I guess I would ask the questions of like, what is the purpose of determining accountability, and you know, does that speak to kind of other aspects of the system that need to be changed? Are we kind of you know, closing off work or constraining work into manageable bits so that I am comfortable that I'm accountable for this scope? But then on a more global level, that can actually be counterproductive because it requires kind of more of a distributed response. So I think it's a very, you know, one of the things that actually sort of struck me as you asked that question was, you know, when you are deploying tools that are a critical part of your business and you have a sort of traditional vendor relationships that says, you know, here's the agreement, here's the expected reliability, but the service goes down. It doesn't really matter who owns it or who's accountable for it. What matters is like that you're showing up in ways that allow you to sort of bridge the gap between who owns the fault there. So I think that we're at a point where there's that kind of conversation needs to shift a little bit and look at how do we create shared responsibilities across organizations and teams and individuals.
I'll say one thing and then we'll go to our next question. I just find it interesting when we say accountability. Do we mean accountability as in responsibility, or are those different things, or what are we actually talking about when we use accountability? Anyway.
Okay, I have a question just for anybody on the panel. So I work on a small team, and we're part of a larger corporation. So I kind of want to know, how can we work from the bottom up to create a more positive supporting culture to foster resiliency from the bottom up perspective? Because our management and everything is pro-resiliency. We're trying to get, but it's hard to kind of get that, especially when we have had employees that have been there for a very long time. And that's just what I would like to know.
I'm a big fan of finding the narrative. Like, so what I'm hearing as well is like, you know the value you want to bring, and you're trying to align that value to a business value. So it really comes down to like, what is the path? Like, what is either the KPI or the success story that you can tell so that it permeates your community inside the company. It really comes down to that storytelling and like using that necessity of the human brain to look for a story and latch onto it, and that anecdote ruling to be your way into it. So I'd find out like if there is an initiative that needs to happen that your team is doing better than somebody else, and you can present that in a light where we're actually sharing accountability in a way that's a-traditional for the company, and lo and behold, it's more effective than these other ways, and look at the metrics that support it. Like that, I find that when you can have a business-based argument for something, like you do the practices that you're going to do, but then you have to get out of your own purview and like take on whatever the business challenge mindset is and adjust your story to that.
Yeah, I definitely agree on like the KPI standpoint.
Yeah.
I recently had this conversation because that's one of the hardest parts, and I think you mentioned that as well. Like, what do you measure? What is success? But you need to tell that story with data. It needs to be data-driven when you make these sort of persuasive bids for work, and it doesn't always have to be constrained in whatever your system values today. For example, if the thing that you are doing kind of like say reduces a latency in a very like small part of the system, that's not obvious what its impact to the overall business is. First of all, make sure that you have something like that to measure. Like if you don't even have any metrics that's measuring your system, you should get those. And it doesn't mean that you need to measure them because you think what's good or what's bad. You need to know what's normal is, and then you can think about how to improve it. Once you have something that you know you can measure and improve, that sort of tells a story. And then you can also think a little bit bigger on like, if I improve this thing that I am responsible for, what business value add that the current business doesn't already have open up? So like think both on like what are you able to see and what could it possibly impact today and what could it possibly impact tomorrow to help with the narrative.
I think the narrative is key, and I'm going to slightly disagree by saying you have to show it with data because it depends on who you're trying to convince. Because different personalities have different drives, and some people don't care about numbers and will argue with math based on how they feel. And it sounds like a joke. So it depends on who you're trying to convince, and you need to see what's important to them. You need to tell that story, and where you do tell it with data is in the numbers that might be numbers, right, with words that are the way to convince for the things that matter to them. And the thing is, you may find yourself in a position where they're not convincible, and that's the sad part, right? And the pessimist in me, which says there's some organizations that won't happen, and you might have to find somewhere else to be because transitions like this don't work without eventually something happening up there. You know, there's people that we've talked to, and we talked about how, you know, at PagerDuty, we have things to say, this is how we can help you see if your teams are going to burn out. And then there's senior leadership in an organization that says, I pay them a lot of money, I don't care. And that's when we can show that person all the data in the world about how expensive it is to keep someone from burnout. That person has literally said the words, I don't care. They're arguing with numbers. So you have to, and that particular person, I can't tell you how to argue with them. I would say, if I knew the name of the company and I could tell you specifically, and it said if you work there, then go find another job right now.
And I think something that came up yesterday in the panel was making sure that you start with opt-in, not just assuming that people are okay with it. And so that, I think Nora mentioned that yesterday, and I talked to someone else about it again last night. And starting with opt-in means you can start building those small areas where you can start building those anecdotes. You can start building the data, both qualitative and quantitative. And I think one of the things that we go toward so often when we go, well, we're data-driven, is the quantitative metrics, right, the numbers. And there's also qualitative metrics. So making sure that you're gathering those stories, but starting with the opt-in, so then you can take the success stories to other teams, like Matt was saying, and say, well, it worked over here, and here's a way it could work for you as well, and we'd really like to get you on board now.
That's a really good point, because I find like, you know, you see maybe one person complaining and someone might push back, be like, why should we prioritize this? Only one person complained.
Mm-hmm.
But it's super important because one person took the time to complain. Think of all the people who didn't complain and just gave up.
Yep.
Yeah.
And one last thought on that is that you don't necessarily need permission to start interacting with mindfulness and bringing mindfulness into your team. I wish I knew earlier in my career that people don't really care what I do. Quite honestly, it's like they're measuring you based on your results. So if if your practices and your team's practices are producing better results, you can tell them when you're ready. But like, don't feel like you need permission to have a better day at your job.
If Matt's advice gets you fired, he will hire you.
I do feel obligated to help if I get you fired. Yes.
I think I saw 2 hands, so maybe time for 2 questions.
Yeah, so I really liked Matt's breakdown of communication and the different types of communication and how it's such an important role within a team or within resiliency. So I just wanted to hear from everybody else, like, what does effective communication look like to you, and maybe a memorable moment where it really kind of elevated your team or your workflow.
So I can start with that. I think that one thing that is kind of prevalent in the mindfulness community is this self-focused narrative. It's not about being like self-centered, but it's talking about from a standpoint, instead of saying, you're hurting my feelings, saying my feelings were hurt when this happened, if there's something, but just a negative situation. I think that having that face-to-face communication is really key when you're having difficult conversations, trying to just be as open and honest as possible. And if you can do that face-to-face, it's much easier. I just think going back again to yesterday, the theme of psychological safety, I think that that is so important for communication, feeling like you are empowered to say what you're feeling and what you're thinking, and regardless of how you communicate, I think that is, in my opinion, the most important communicative situation.
I think empathy is a really important piece of communication, and with resiliency, I think one thing we realized when we started filing tickets against ourselves before we started farming them out was that these tickets were like pretty unreasonable to give to people. So it's like putting yourselves in those shoes. In that case, we could like literally put ourselves in their shoes, but well, I guess not actually literally, but trying to do that more, even like when you're sending a broad communication to a lot of teams, maybe you don't interact with a lot, but trying to put yourself on the receiving end of that and what you would think.
In my own work recently, I've had to change my communication style because the other half of the communication style of the communication problem is listening, is hearing what the other person is trying to say. And some of the people I work with, okay, our CEO, like they really, and our VP, they really like to communicate through code. They're like, the only way that I can really talk to them is if I've read every commit that they've made since I last worked on the code. And at first I found that unreasonable, but then I made an automation to make it easier for me. And now, and once I do that, once I'm in their context and I share enough of their context, then I can ask them questions from about what they changed, like with that perspective. And so like doing the research to get someone else's context, it's not always possible, but hey, Git actually really helps with this. That has made my communication a lot more effective. And in an asynchronous team, communicating through code, actually, it's pretty reasonable. Yeah.
The key about that, and I'm glad you said that because I'm able to build on it, is we do have different communication styles. And it's incumbent upon me to learn yours. Because I can't expect you I can't, if I'm having a communication problem with you, I can't say, well, the problem is you aren't communicating the way that I want to be communicated with. I have no control over that part of the situation. The only thing I have control over is changing how I communicate. So being able to learn the communication styles of people that you manage or that manage you, because it's a big key part of managing up is understand that you especially aren't going to have your boss change their communication style, but even as a manager to expect that you understand the way that the people you interact with want to communicate with or want to be communicated with is really key, and that's a big part. That's empathy right there.
And I think that's part of where accountability comes in again too, right? We are accountable to make sure that we are communicating clearly to the people that we are communicating with. And we are also accountable to make sure that if we aren't being clearly communicated to, that we express that and try and figure out what the problem is there too.
And my addition is I find it really useful to have team tenets. Like, identify what you guys agree on early on. And that makes every following argument so much more easier because you start off at where you agree. And that colors the decisions that you make.
I have one anecdote for you and that absolutely set it up for it. I promise we didn't plan that. But the idea of taking whatever is implicit in your communication right now and moving it as far towards explicit as possible has been absolutely key. And one specific for our team, the leadership team at Sensu, we used to just live and die in Slack all day. And now we have 35 employees. It was just 10 when I started. And it's just not reasonable anymore. You can't catch up with all the context, especially with all the automation coming in there too. So as old school as it is, we promised each other, okay, decisions that were made, if we're codifying them, we're going to send it to a mailing list so that you can go back in time and see that mailing list. And that is the definitive answer to something. It's not going to be a random Slack message in a channel you didn't happen to check for a couple days or hit, I don't want to read it. So just going to that explicit, and that's written in something we call the handbook. It's a private GitHub repo, which is our team practices, so that they're all clear for anybody who's currently there, and you can go through the commit log there and actually learn quite a lot about our growing context.
All right, one last question, and then a couple of quick closing thoughts. Yeah?
It depends on how long the question is. One, maybe two. We'll see.
It's David asking, so.
All right, go ahead.
Okay, I promise I can make it really quick. So John Cage used to ask, are things getting better or are they getting worse? So I would be interested in striping the panel to ask them, are things getting better or are they getting worse? And if you wouldn't mind saying in one sentence or less why you believe that to be the case.
I'll go first. I can do this. Okay. One sentence with many semicolons.
You're taking cues from David from yesterday.
I learned.
There you go.
Adapting. I think that things are getting better, and I think that it is because we are focusing more on awareness, both of the problems that we face and also the ways that we can combat those problems, and being aware that we are humans and not robots. Semicolon. I had a conversation earlier today about how technology has grown so quickly that this is all new to everybody. You say you're in the tech game for a long time, that means 5 years, potentially. And so we're all learning, we're all growing, and I think that by becoming more aware of the personal and community and technological systems that we're dealing with, we can create more resilience and things can get better. So I think that just the fact that this conference exists shows that things are getting better.
I think they're getting a little better. They're going to get a lot worse before they get even better. And the reason I think they're getting better is just what Lee said, because we're having a conference like this, because these conversations are happening, because people are having FOMO for not being here. So that's why things are getting better. They're about to get a lot worse because everyone's going to want to now pray at the church of John Allspaw and have John tell them what to do, which he won't do because he's smart enough to not do that. And they're going to want to go and copy paste all the Netflix code. And they're going to want to figure out exactly what Amazon does and cargo cult it in. And it's going to be terrible. And then we're going to rise from those ashes because we are resilient. And it will be a lot better.
Can I subscribe to your newsletter?
You can at devopsdispatch.com.
I think things are getting different. I think that it's too early to tell, like where this is going and which way it's trending.
Yeah, I don't know if I can say much about things. I feel like I've been cult, like I worked at EA Sports and then I worked at Amazon. So I know that I don't have great perspective. I've been drinking the Kool-Aid. But I mean, things got better for me. In terms of like my shift in perceptions, and I'll have to say, like, at one point, the way that like I thought or like my team thought was like automate everything, that was the goal, and now it's like, and because we were like, yes, humans are flawed, never trust humans, and now it's like, wait, maybe we can make humans better. So in that respect, I think things are getting better.
My thought is my favorite quote of late, and it's the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. Okay, I'll add one more sentence here. Okay, and in that sense, I think it's better for a lot of us that have embraced newer forms of communication, newer forms of attacking problems and seeing the benefit of working collaboratively and working openly and being more vulnerable than we have been in the past and less top-down authoritative and more collaborative. But that is a very small tip of the overall bell curve of different technology organizations, and I think everyone in this room is probably at that tip or you wouldn't be here. So we have a lot of work to do to make sure others continue to have that opportunity and start to kind of catch up to the timeline there.
More broadly scoped. My daughter has a YouTube channel, and she made this video with this app that she has on her iPad, and in it, she's got these little cartoon characters, and one of them comes out as a werewolf, and the other one comes out as pansexual, and I'm like, this is awesome, things are getting better.
I think for me personally, things are getting better because I used to think that the superstar would be the one that got paged all the time and fixed everything, and then I've now kind of realized that's not real.
Cool. That's a great last question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Let's thank the panel. That was a great discussion.
Thanks, everyone.